Hello everyone, Mr. Dempsey here. Welcome to video 9-2. We're going to be looking today at how plants have evolved from green algae and over evolutionary time evolved adaptations to land, especially to drier environments. And here we have a timeline of Earth history, and over on the left-hand side we have the various geological periods, beginning with the Ordovician. And one of the first groups of plants to evolve were the bryophytes. Bryophytes, they share a lot of characteristics with green algae, like the seaweed over here, in the sense that they don't have vascular tissue and they depend on a very wet environment. And we're going to look at alternation and generation as another trait that all plants have in common with green algae. Later on, we have the seedless vascular plants evolve, so those would be the pteridophytes, ferns, horsetails, that group. Later, the cone seed plants, gymnosperms, start to evolve. And then finally, we have the flowering plants, angiosperms. So we're going to be looking at the context in which plants evolve these characteristics over time. We're going to begin with the fact that the seed plants have pollen typically. And so if we compare that to seedless plants, such as ferns and moss, they all have swimming sperm. So they depend on a very wet environment in order for their sperm to swim. So you can't swim without water. So that's why moss and fern often live in those wetter habitats, so they could fertilize their sperm. Over time, though, the continents begin to merge together to create a supercontinent called Pangaea. That happens actually a little bit before the dinosaurs begin to evolve in what's called the Permian period. And so by this time of this picture here, this reconstruction of the early Triassic, plants are beginning to evolve to these drier conditions, and we're going to be looking at some of those adaptations that begin to evolve, and we'll be looking at pollen here in a moment. So as a brief introduction, here we have gymnosperms, a type of seed plant, and you can see that they're making pollen which is released into the air, so wind-blown pollen. Compared to over here we have an angiosperm, another type of seed plant, and they're making pollen that is dispersed by insects. So, but the point here is that that pollen is not, or that type of sperm, which is pollen, is not reliant on a wet environment. So pollen, a type of sperm, can be dispersed in other ways besides swimming. It can be dispersed by being blown to the wind or be carried by insects. We'll now look at spores versus seeds. So here's a fern, and if you look at the underside of a fern, you can see these little areas right here where spores are produced. So what are the differences between a spore and a seed is size. So spores are much, much smaller than seeds are. In fact, you can't actually see a spore with your naked eye. They're so small. Seeds, in contrast, can be much larger. In fact, some can be huge, like a coconut, which is a type of seed. And one of the reasons why seeds are larger than spores is because in them is something called endosperm, this characteristic right here. Endosperm is food for the baby plant. So here we have the embryonic plant inside the seed right here. That's the baby plant. And the endosperm contains carbohydrates and proteins. And that is going to nourish that baby plant to grow, so it gives it sort of a boost of energy. It's like a backpack of food nutrients, which that plant can grow in an area that's a little bit more variable and not as favorable. And so the plant can go for days and days and days without having to photosynthesize, and it's relying on that endosperm. If we contrast that to a spore doesn't have endosperm, so it doesn't have any kind of a food reserve. So it has to very quickly begin to photosynthesize, and the environmental conditions have to be perfect. There has to be ample sunlight and plenty of water for them to grow. Compared to a seed, the conditions can be more wide-ranging, and that gives the seed plants a much greater ability to occupy environments that are not always ideal, that are not always moist and always perfect. And that has helped the seed plants become the dominant group of plants today on Earth. Alright, so now another trait I want to look at with you here is alternation and generation. So let's recall how that process works. You may remember that from Mr. Matthews' video on the previous 9-1, but let's go through that again. So in alternation and generation, we're going to start off with the sporophyte stage, which is diploid. The sporophyte will undergo meiosis to produce these haploid spores. The spores can get dispersed by the wind in certain cases, such as the seedless plants. They will get dispersed by the wind. They'll land on the ground and they'll be germinating and grow into a gametophyte. The gametophyte's job is to then make gametes. Through mitosis that happens. And then those gametes will get fertilized and that will produce a new sporophyte again. So that's something that all plants undergo, this basic process of alternation of generations. So for example, if we compare that process of alternation of generations in this type of seed plant, which is called a gymnosperm, gymnosperms, for example, make cones, as you can see, like a pine tree, for example, is a gymnosperm. So here we're looking at the sporophyte, and that sporophyte will undergo meiosis, and we're going to focus on this female cone. So that's the larger cone here, that's the male cone. But we'll focus on the female cone. It's going to undergo meiosis. It's going to produce a type of spore. Spores always make gametophytes. Gametophytes always make a gamete, in this case an egg. And that egg could get fertilized by a pollen grain, which is a type of sperm. And that will produce a new sporophyte again. So let's look at some examples of some gymnosperms. So here we have a cycad. Those grow in typically warmer tropical places. You might see them in Florida, for example. Here's a ginkgo, another type of gymnosperm, and we have conifers like pine trees and spruces and so forth. So one thing that those plants all have is some type of a cone that they produce. So if we were to look at a place like the fossil evidence from the time of the Triassic and Jurassic, for example, the dominant plants living at that time were the gymnosperms. So here we have some conifers over here, here's some more, here's some cycads over here, maybe there's some ginkgos deeper down in the forest over there. These are the type of plants you would find from that time period of the early to mid Mesozoic era. So keep in mind that gymnosperms, they evolve pollen, which doesn't require water for fertilization. So it's sort of a more dry habitat type of environment in which pollen can get dispersed, for example, by the wind, and that could lead to fertilization to grow a new plant. So the pollen, a type of sperm, is not reliant anymore on a moist environment for fertilization. Seeds are another benefit because remember that seeds have that endosperm, and that's going to give that plant a boost of energy so it could grow in a more wide-ranging environment. It might be drier, may not be always ideal, and that's going to give that growing plant a food reserve to grow in more various environments that are not always wet. Alright, so now we're going to look at the Cretaceous period. So we're at the end of the Mesozoic era, so there's still dinosaurs around at this time. And so we would find flowering plants, as paleontologists find these type of fossils in various places in the world today. And so after the end of the Mesozoic era, flowering plants continue to diversify. So here we're looking at a place in Germany. This is tropical rainforest 49 million years ago in a place near Frankfurt. This is actually a fairly famous fossil site called the Messel Oil Shale. And it's like a whole ecosystem that has been preserved in this place in Germany. So for example, you find very delicate structures that are preserved here. Here's a flower from Messel, Germany, some berries, some broad leaves. And we have a really good sense of what this environment is like. And we're not focusing on the animals in this video, but here are the plants. And alongside those plants are all kinds of animals, such as bats, various birds, and social insects. And so what we're seeing at this time is there's a coevolution between animals such as social insects and bats and birds and flowers, flowering plants. And that helps both in two ways. One is for dispersal of their pollen. So gymnosperms, like conifers for example, are using the wind to disperse their pollen. But that's not a very efficient method. Here we have pollinators, like for example a fruit bat perhaps, that could land on a flower and disperse the pollen in a very direct way. In addition, these animals can act as seed dispersers. So maybe a fruit bat consumes the entire fruit, seeds and all, eventually defecates those seeds out and disperses the seeds. So there's an entanglement, a mutualism between various animals and these plants, these flowering plants, which help to increase their ability to fertilize and disperse offspring. So let's focus on that just a little bit more in detail here. So here we have a gymnosperm. So gymnosperms, like these conifers, are releasing their pollen. This is the male cone, and the pollen will be released into the air. And you can imagine much of that pollen is just landing everywhere. It's not a very direct way to disperse those male gametes, the pollen. In contrast, angiosperms have evolved ways to entice animals. So a flower will make nectar. It has sort of a large advertisement with all these flowery petals and makes an aroma. That's very enticing to the insect, and ultimately the insect is going to get nectar, which is food from the flower. And in trying to get that nectar, the insect is getting pollen all over it from the male parts of the flower. And then there's not much food the insect is getting, so it flies to another flower to get some more nectar, and therefore disperses the pollen. So angiosperms have a very specific way to distribute their pollen from one plant to the next, as opposed to gymnosperms like this over here, which the pollen is released sort of haphazardly by the wind. And so that's probably one of the reasons why angiosperms have become a dominant type of plant today. Most plants you see outside are angiosperms. Gymnosperms are much less common compared to angiosperms today. So let's focus on their seed dispersal here. So here we're looking at a gymnosperm. Gymnosperm actually comes from a Greek word which means naked. Gymno means naked. Sperm is essentially seed. And so the seeds in this cone are sort of exposed or naked. You could take a pine cone that's mature and dry and shake it, and the seeds will come flying out. And that's because those seeds are sort of exposed or naked inside the cone. Compare that to an angiosperm. Angio means vessel, and so the plant material is surrounding the seeds. You could shake a tomato or an apple all you want, and those seeds are not going to come flying out. So they're kind of protected inside the plant. But more importantly, the fruit, which is surrounding that seed, is again a way to entice an animal to possibly eat the entire fruit, seeds and all, and then the animal walks away or flies away if it's a bat, and then defecates out those seeds as a way of dispersing the offspring. So again, it's a more kind of a targeted way, in this case, to deliver the seeds from one place to another, as opposed to the wind, which is used by the gymnosperms to disperse their seeds. So just to pick up on that idea of alternation and generation I was mentioning earlier, that process continues through angiosperms, that process of alternation and generation. So let's just look at that again in flowering plants. Here we have a sporophyte, which is diploid. The diploid sporophyte undergoes meiosis to produce a type of spore. But in gymnosperms and angiosperms, those spores don't get released. They stay inside the plant. So in the gymnosperms, spores are hidden within the cones. In angiosperms, the spores are hidden within the flower. And the spores, like in all plants, will develop into a gametophyte. The gametophyte's job is always to make gametes, like an egg. If that egg gets fertilized, that will result in a new offspring. And in this case, that would produce a new sporophyte plant, like the flower growing up out of the ground. So the point here is that we see this process of alternation and generation in all plants. And plants evolve that process of alternation and generation ultimately way back from their green algae ancestors. So here's a cousin to plants today, ulva, which is a type of green algae. And you can see the process of alternation and generation here. Sporophyte undergoing meiosis to make spores. These spores, being in the water, will swim. They will fertilize. They will make a gametophyte. The gametophyte will make these gametes, like swimming sperm, for example, which will fertilize. That will make a zygote, and that will grow into a new sporophyte. So as plants begin to evolve onto land, they carry with them that same process of alternation and generation. It's a conserved trait. So just like you have vestiges of your ape ancestry, such as your body hair, your wisdom teeth, your tailbone, those are all characteristics that are part of your primate past. Those are vestiges of your evolution. So are so is the process of alternation and generation. Finally, last point is we're looking at different types of angiosperms. So angiosperms come in two major groups, monocots and dicots. So the The endosperm I was mentioning earlier in this group of plants comes as sort of one package, monocot, which is this one package is endosperm. In this other group here, it comes in these two packages of where that endosperm is found. But an easier way to determine a monocot or a dicot is to look at their leaves. So you think of corn or grass, and you look carefully at their leaves, you'd see that their veins are parallel in that grass or corn. Also, their roots are fibrous, so you could pull grass up pretty easily out of the ground. The roots don't go very deep. As opposed to maybe a dandelion or a carrot, those roots go deep, and that's because that's another kind of plant, a eudicot, which have tap roots. Also, the leaves of a dandelion or a carrot or a maple leaf, they're branching. That's another way you can tell the difference between a eudicot and a monocot. So thanks for watching the video. And next ones you're going to be seeing are on animals, and we'll be looking at the evolution and adaptations of animals later on.